Good morning again. Good morning. Are we here? Very good. Wanted to make sure everyone is still awake. Yes. Again, I'd like to thank Sandy and his team and all of those individuals who've been responsible for putting together this amazing symposium, Reflections on the Impact of the Reconstruction Amendments. It's on the 150th anniversary, so it's so important, and what a wonderful lecture we began with Gunter Peck. I am Cynthia Neal Spence, and I have the task of introducing our next panel of very distinguished women scholars. As a Spelman College graduate and administrator and faculty member, I'm always very happy to lift up the voices of women scholars. Ajane is a PhD student in public policy with a political science concentration at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. Ajane is, her academic research focuses on the most important factors that help and harm police-community relationships, focusing especially on African Americans and European Muslims. Again, she's asking very important questions that are historicized, but particularly as we think about some contemporary issues now as we look at policing, race, and community issues. She has been able to convene leaders from various religious, ethnic, and refugee minority groups to collectively envision a national leadership development program to strengthen inclusion and equity by fostering minority coalitions. She will be in the near future interviewing local community leaders and law enforcement management regarding their interactions to further her research. And we're always happy to have a PhD student, someone who clearly will join all of us as we attempt to transform the academy, but by transforming the academy not only through her presence, but through her knowledge and her lens. And so I'm really happy to have these three women scholars joining us this morning. And I'm going to ask each of them to just talk a little bit about their work and how their work helps to illuminate and expand upon the discussions of the 13th Amendment and its impact on the social and economic outcomes of the U.S., and particularly historically, but also contemporarily as we look at some of the issues that we are constantly seeing in the media now. And so I'd love for you all to begin to talk about your work, and then I will intervene and ask other questions. And then at the end, we will also provide opportunities for the audience to ask questions. Okay, Ashana.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Cynthia, for the introduction, and Sandy for being a great mentor and putting on this wonderful program with the Cook Center and the National Archives. So one of the things about my past before I became a PhD student is that I helped establish a government agency for the city and county of Denver called the Office of the Independent Monitor in 2005. And the Office of the Independent Monitor were civilians that oversaw the investigations of police and sheriff internal affairs complaints, so allegations of police and sheriff misconduct. They were, investigated by internal affairs, and then we were civilians that would come in and ensure that those investigations were fair, thorough, quality, and timely. So I was a community relations ombudsman. My role was to basically be a liaison between the police and the community. I had relationships with communities, with organizations. I would speak with them. I would help staff and execute our televised public meetings. I would run our citizen police mediation program, in which we had professional mediators who would facilitate the conversations between officers and complainants. And I worked with folks one-on-one to resolve their police complaints. But because our office was objective and neutral, I also formed relationships with police officers. And so I had excellent working relationships with the sergeants and lieutenants in internal affairs. I went to officers' meetings, saw how they were trained at the police academy, went to Christmas parties, barbecues. I spoke with hundreds individually about their complaints to see if they were also willing to participate in our mediation process. And so for that 5-year period from 2005 to 2010, I heard one thing a lot, and that is police officers say, we're the good guys chasing the bad guys. Or the good guys chasing the bad guys was more than a catchphrase, and even more than an ethos, it was an identity. and it was and remains so. But this is problematic for many reasons. I'll just name a couple here. First, it's not a useful framework to approach many or even most of the problems that police officers encounter on the job, and that is helping people, often at their worst, to resolve and sort of navigate their life's most complicated, messy, painful, vulnerable, confusing life experiences. It's helping parents to resolve issues with their teenagers. It's helping resolve disputes between neighbors. It's shepherding people into a safe place to spend the night, et cetera. So being an officer requires extraordinary communication skills. And they're often mediating, interacting with people in crisis, and trying to reason with folks who are suffering from mental illness. So placing judgments on people such as good and bad can be ineffective because such labels too often get in the way of de-escalating crisis and of problem solving. It's more often the case, actually, that policing requires you to set aside such judgments. Second, this identity in which one is fixated on rooting out the bad guys is problematic because the truth is they're too often not that good at distinguishing the difference between good and bad. And so as we have seen cases such as New York Police Department stop and frisk program, it's easy to miss the cues you should see, and then it's also easy to sort of misread behaviors into conclusions. For example, furtive eye movement was often a cause used to stop and frisk people, search their persons, search their belongings, in full public view of everyone they know, walking from home to school or from work to home, and going through their belongings and everything. But what is furtive eye movement? I mean, ostensibly, it's sort of this shifting your eyes around in some sort of guilty fashion. But practically speaking, it's not giving police officer the kind of eye contact that they consider to be appropriate while walking down the street. So clearly, this sort of subjectivity, you can see how unconstitutional policing practices pile up, which ultimately is what a federal judge decided in the case of New York. This illustrates, though, how a fixation on finding bad guys and then not being able to tell the difference between the good and bad guys ends up costing too many Black, brown, and Native folk their freedom and certainly their lives. That was the case for Terrence Crutcher in Tulsa, Oklahoma, whose car broke down on the side of the road. Officers arrived, and he probably assumed to help him. Instead, he soon found himself tased and shot to death by a female officer. But that was not before officers flying over in a helicopter who could not hear anything going on beneath them declared, "This looks like a bad dude." Hearing this judgment and what she felt was character assassination play out on the nightly news over and over, Crutcher's sister Tiffany responded, quote, "That big bad dude was my twin brother. That big bad dude was a father. That big bad dude was a son. That big bad dude was enrolled at Tulsa Community College just wanting to make us proud. That big bad dude loved God. That big bad dude was at church singing with all of his flaws every week. That big bad dude, that's who he was," end quote. The ease with American society and by extension its enforcement arm prejudges or too easily mistakes people of color in general and Black boys and men in particular as bad dudes didn't just emerge from nowhere. This association of Blacks with danger and violence and criminality pervades society, and police officers step into that. But it did not appear by accident, and it did not appear overnight. It was conjured up at the inception of our nation by the Anglo land-owning wealthy male elite to create a fear that would motivate the white masses to help them maintain their positions of power in exchange for protecting them and their women from Indians and Blacks, and in certain parts of the country, and at certain times, Chinese and Mexicans. But this special singling out of Blacks for labeling to associate violence and immorality was a strategic decision by those that control the economy. And the positioning of Blacks at the bottom of the social hierarchy had come about in order to fuel America's economic order of choice. We get caught up in this collective character assassination of African Americans because it's so hurtful that no matter how much progress we've made in spite of everything, Blacks remain labeled in this fashion. We get caught up in our outrage when news selectively reports on criminal behavior or when candidate Trump makes the assertion that you can't even walk down the street in an African-American neighborhood without being shot in the neck, on the rare occasion that he even talks about black people. These characterizations of African-Americans are so devastating that it can be hard to kind of take a step back and look at the purpose of all this. And what is that purpose? I'm glad you asked. This vilification has always been necessary to justify the subjugation of black bodies for economic purposes. In other words, some people assume that you have to sort of dehumanize people first and then extract resources from them, like labor or sex or the next generation of workers. But in fact, you can extract these things and then tell yourself a story or tell others a story about why you're doing all these things so you can still maintain your sense of self as a good person if you need to. So let's connect this to the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment states, quote, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." For context, we need to step back and understand what was at stake for the American South with slavery and why they were willing to wage the bloodiest war in United States history to protect this institution. So I'm going to share a couple of quotes from Emory professor Carol Anderson's book, White Rage. She first quotes Mississippi's Articles of Secession. And so this is Mississippi's justification for separating the United States from the United States of America. It reads as follows, quote, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth," end quote. Anderson herself then adds, quote, "In fact, 2/3 of the wealthiest Americans at the time lived in the slaveholding South. 81% of South Carolina's wealth was directly tied to owning human beings. In 1860, on the eve of Civil War, 80% of the nation's GDP was tied to slavery." In a nutshell, what does this tell us? The American economic order rested on total exploitation of black labor. Today, what the United States has is essentially a $200 billion jobs program that we call the criminal justice system. It gives mostly whites jobs supervising and controlling mostly black and brown people. It has failed. It has not kept us safe. And if anything, it has created more criminals than it purports to catch. But perhaps that's the point. Otherwise, we'd have to come up with a really huge jobs program, which I can talk about during Q&A. The United States incarcerates more of its citizens than any other country in the world, but the fuller story is not just the 2.3 million Americans who are locked up, right, or the staggering 7.1 million Americans who are currently under correctional supervision. It's the tens of millions with felony convictions who cycle through the criminal justice system and then face legal discrimination in every aspect of their lives, which we often refer to as sort of collateral damage or collateral consequences. Now, after relegating prisoners to the margins long after they've served their sentences, these returning citizens are legally barred from jobs, housing, voting, educational pursuits, financial aid, any avenue to re-enter mainstream society. So in addition to the jobs that are created to cage, warehouse, and monitor millions of black, brown, native, and poor white folk, huge swaths of the job market are cleared from competition. Competition for whites who would otherwise be forced to compete for those jobs. In closing, I just want to close the loop on this economic order piece. The economic order structures the socio-political order. And what do I mean by that? The political order, the political institutions, the political rules, the public policies are put in place to serve the most powerful economic interests. This is what allows for a loophole to be inserted in the 13th Amendment in the first place.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you. So thank you, and each of you raised very important points, and I'll throw this out for all three of you. I'm thinking about, the work of, as you lift up the work of Carol Anderson, Angela Davis, Michelle Alexander, who all talk about the prison and industrial complex, and some will even trace its lineage to the 13th Amendment because of that particular clause saying, that there cannot be involuntary servitude but for punishment of a crime. And so these scholars talk about the distrust that exists between the African American community, but other marginalized communities and law enforcement as having its origins within the just the realities of what happened post 13th Amendment. As DuBois says that, the 13th Amendment was a legislation, it was policy. But the reality was that black people were really very much responsible for their own freedom. And there were numerous acts of resistance that perhaps have not been documented well, and that's why the work that DuBois has lifted up in her work is so important. And then you all also talk about black bodies just being commodities and the commodification of the black body. And I think that the visual imagery, is another act of resistance. And so as we think about this particular period in time, Mark Weiner talks about the law in Black Trials. I'm not sure if you all are familiar with that text, but he says, you're supposed to have a law for the people, right? But the people have to be considered worthy. They have to be considered worthy to be people of the law. And certainly our history suggests that black folks were not considered worthy. And certainly there were acts of resistance to prove our worthiness. So perhaps in the visual representations that were created or the acts of resistance that you found among women. And these stories are not heard, these stories are not told. But then also the ways in which you are looking at police-community relations right now, and where black people are saying, I'm maybe not articulating it exactly, but basically they're feeling as if they're not considered worthy for the protection of the law. And so I'd like for you all to just kind of talk about your work in ways, talking about acts of resistance, talking about the ways in which imagery is an act of resistance, the ways in which black women within the households or within the war as Union soldiers were actually, creating an economic base for their community was in fact an act of resistance. And some of the protests now are acts of resistance because it's about establishing oneself as being worthy of protection. So,
I think the question actually reminds me of another example of connecting the economic order to the socio-political order. And we can see an example of that in the 3/5 compromise. So just, a refresher, at the beginning of the founding of the country, the South wanted to count, so, they're deciding what representation should look like at the federal level. Every state gets the 2 senators so that the small and large states have equal representation. But with Congress, it's decided that they would be apportioned based on the population. Well, the South wanted to count the slaves into their numbers, and the North said, no, I thought they were property. And not from some sense of moral outrage, but because they didn't want to be outmaneuvered politically. And so it was decided that it would be 3/5 of a person that would be counted for slaves, which, because of the explosion of slavery, allowed the South to really sort of dominate politics for probably until the 1900s or so. Yeah. But anyway, so what we see is that now black and brown folks are often shipped outside of cities to rural areas, to overwhelmingly white areas, and those areas are receiving dollars, right, per those prisoners. That's part of their economic development. And then in terms of the census count that comes out every 10 years, those folks are counted as part of those towns' populations, even though they don't have rights. And so the U.S. Department of Commerce is allocating $400 billion for that to anticipate infrastructure needs and sort of community needs. So they're getting extra sort of bonus dollars based on those prisoners. And then in terms of political representation, those prisoners are also counted. So vis-a-vis their local jurisdictions, they have too much political power, and certainly in the state legislatures and then in Congress as well, we see disproportionate political power going to those areas. So, folks have tried to combat that politically in a variety of ways, which also is sort of an interesting thing that's happening behind the scenes. But, you have people who are trying to reinstate voting rights. You have people trying to get out the word during census counts to make sure that people are aware and that they're being counted. You have black legislators who are trying to change the way in which those prisoners are counted and reapportion those back to the cities where they belong. So there's all kinds of ways in which black folks are trying to reassert their political power to combat some of these arrangements. Reading things like Douglas Blackman's Slavery by Another Name, Re-Enslavement of African Americans from post-Civil War to World War II. In addition to Carol Anderson's book, Dog Whistle Politics by Ian Haney Lopez, helps us to see actually that this is just the latest iteration, and this is entirely consistent with all of American history, what we're seeing right now. So in that sense, even though there are a lot of really specific criminal justice reforms that we could enact, the important thing is to sort of back up and look at the economic structure that's shaping the existence of the criminal justice system in the first place, and the growing and sort of strengthening of that, and the rhetoric that then comes into to buttress the growth and the explosion of that criminal justice system. So, so any sort of approach to criminal justice reform is going to have to entail an enormous sort of jobs, education program that I think, and infrastructure that not only comes in to support the connection of the areas that are like concentrations of poor folks that have been isolated and contained, right? That the transportation infrastructure and things that allow them to become freely moving to where the jobs are, but then also the education, the post-high school, post-secondary education, training, development in economic centers that are going to help create those jobs, so that you're also getting rid of the need to police and to warehouse and to be sheriffs and things like that. So you have to replace it with something, right? So it's going to have to be coupled, both the new economic opportunities for the folks who are engaged currently in the criminal justice system, and the others who don't have other job opportunities, as well as creating new educational and economic opportunities for people who are currently imprisoned, and sort of opening up politically those opportunities for them to be able to move into those jobs and start removing all these barriers of housing and financial aid and all these sorts of things.
There's a question.
It seemed like a lot of the talk was about the incongruence of political representation with actual representation. So I'm wondering, is there prospectively the optimism around demography potentially saving us? Is there any cautionary tales from the past?
No, demography cannot save us. Otherwise, South Africa would have worked out a little bit differently. There's a lot that can be done with maneuvering and gerrymandering and redistricting to carve really, really crazy lines that restrict, minimize, dilute, disempower folks who are trying to vote, and take away their votes. So, there's a lot of ways to prevent people from expressing their political power. And so that doesn't just come about because you have more numbers. Mm-hmm. And so there's all kinds of ways that people are trying to sort of reclaim that or claim it in the first place. And I think that, particularly in 2008 and 2012, African Americans in particular were the highest voting population. So, we see that we're there, we're trying, we're making all kinds of progress. When you look nationally, in the state legislatures, for example, African Americans are at least 10%, or about 10% of representation in the state legislature. So, there are gains we're almost at parity with our population. But these don't just come automatically. They're hard fought, they're hard won gains. Yes.
Did anyone else want to respond? Okay, all right, thank you.
Hello.
I think we have just this last question, is that right? Yes, okay.
So you had mentioned the connection between economics and different forms of black subjugation, whether slavery or mass incarceration. I wanted to ask, we have a multi-billion-dollar bail bond industry, either commercial or privatized, and we have examples of Sandra Bland and Khalif Browder, where you have people that are in jail because they can't afford a particular bond, not necessarily because they're guilty of a crime, since they haven't had their day in court yet, but being that it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, we have several states that are trying to have reform in that area with various levels of success, but how do you see America as a whole kind of weaning ourselves from a commercialized bail bond industry that can easily keep black and brown people incarcerated?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I could answer fully the question, but I mean, I think it points to the larger issue of, $200 billion criminal justice industry.
Yeah.
We're so accustomed in the United States to sort of throwing out billions and trillions. So if you were to put that in context to get a sense of the magnitude of that, I mean, that would be like 13 and a half times the GDP of Jamaica. That would be 15% of the GDP of Russia. It's just extraordinary. So, there has to be some coming together of a very long-term plan to begin unraveling these pieces and figuring out, how to attack them systematically in terms of public policy, but also then bringing in things to replace it. You can't just take stuff away. You have to replace it.
Okay, Jeff. I'm sorry, Anjanae.
It's hard to say that I'm doing important work, but I'll certainly say that I am in pursuit of an important topic, and that I'm chasing. Over the last decade, in working between the city and between police officers and community members, in working with black state legislators who were responding to Ferguson and Baltimore and all these places, and helping them to sort of shape policies that could respond and also be preventive moving forward, and just family and friends and colleagues. Everyone is wanting to know what can be done and what should be done, and it's a really messy, hard, wicked problem. And so I wanted to put my energies toward that, and literally stop what I was doing, pull out of the workforce, and focus on this and see if I could in some way contribute.
Okay, well, thank you. And we want to thank each of them. Give them all. Thank you.